There's an ancient stereotype about French people that's strong, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries, and that is that we have a questionable relationship with hygiene.
As stereotypes go, the one about smelly French people is certainly hard to wash off, which either doesn't or does make a lot of sense given the country's vibrant perfume culture.
So where does this rank stereotype come from? And at the same time, why do French fragrances have such a good reputation around the world?
Join us for this episode of French Connections Plus, where we splash into the pungent world of French perfume and hygiene.
When people think about us Frenchies, one of the first images that comes to mind is Pépé le Pew. Le Pew, a skunk.
Well, historically speaking, this reputation of the French as being smelly is based somewhat in truth.
Well, until the late 19th century, the air was pretty ripe in big cities like Paris, and that's because people, especially the poor working class, just didn't have access to decent running water like they did, say, in British cities at the same time.
Not that it bothered them, though. For many people, not washing was the best way to stay healthy.
Because believe it or not, people believed that water was a conveyor of disease, and so bathing was actually discouraged. And if you combine this with an archaic sewage system, well, it did stink to high heaven a lot of the time, especially compared to modern standards.
Thankfully, we've come a long way since then, and when you ask French people in the street, they'll say they're clean enough.
Well, let's say that if cleanliness is next to godliness, the French are very human and comfortable in their skin.
Je suis français et je le dis, je ne prends pas forcément ma douche tous les jours.
Non, je me lave tous les jours, je vous rassure.
Personne ne peut prendre sa douche tous les jours.
Dans mon entourage, globalement, les gens sont plutôt propres, mais il y a une ou deux personnes pour lesquelles j'ai des doutes.
Ah oui, les dents, c'est important. C'est 3 fois par jour.
Moi, 2 fois, ouais. Matin et soir. Pareil.
Matin, soir, le midi, évidemment, j'y arrive pas toujours.
Oh, je mets du parfum tous les matins. Je ne peux pas sortir sans avoir mis mon parfum.
Moi, je me parfume, mais seulement après une douche, pas pour masquer justement une absence de douche.
Ouais, j'aime bien mettre du parfum.
J'ai pas envie de puer, quoi. Quand les gens ils me voient, j'ai pas envie. J'ai envie, voilà, d'être propre et tout. J'ai envie de montrer une bonne image de moi.
Moi, personnellement, à part l'utilisation du gel hydroalcoolique et du masque, je pense pas avoir changé la moindre habitude.
Moi, je me lave pas plus les mains. Moi, je me lave encore plus les mains, du coup. Ouais, j'ai beaucoup voyagé, on m'a toujours dit « Ah, mais toi, t'es française, t'as juste à te mettre du parfum pour te laver. »
J'ai vécu à Londres et je peux vous dire qu'on a une image de dégueulasse. Hein. Ah, franchement, je sais pas d'où ça vient.
Parce que déjà, la France, c'est sale. Rien que quand on voit les rues ou quoi que ce soit, c'est sale. Alors, j'imagine pas l'hygiène. Hein.
Smelly French people.
Over time, people have become more and more attentive to personal hygiene, and that's even been reflected in the French language.
Well, take, for example, the word toilette, toilet, and how it's evolved over the years. These days, we mainly use it in the plural, aller aux toilettes, go to the toilet, the water closet, where the throne is, essentially. But back in the day, it was actually a piece of linen, une toile, that you would spread out on a table and put your jewelry and finery and makeup on.
From there, toilette went on to mean all the little bottles and boxes that you would use to get ready in the morning when you were putting your face on. And after that, the word went on to mean the actual piece of furniture itself, where you would wash, brush your hair, groom, basically.
And eventually it became a verb, faire sa toilette, essentially to wash up and do all the things that you do when you're getting ready to go out in public. In fact, you might be familiar with the term eau de toilette, which is actually a low-concentration perfume.
Perfume, now that is another interesting word. It comes from the Latin parfumen, which means by smoke. And that's linked back to the ancient practice of burning incense for rituals and for medical practices.
Now, the word perfume, parfum, appeared relatively late in the French language in the early 16th century. And that is, in fact, a clue into France's fascinating fragrance history. While they didn't invent perfume, the French certainly ran with it. The history of perfume in France is in some ways related to the country's stinky reputation. It was Catherine de Medicis, the Italian wife of King Henry II, who is credited with bringing the fashion of perfumes to France in the 16th century. But well into the 17th century, the fear of bathing was strong across society. In fact, rumor has it, King Louis XIV only took 3 baths in his entire life. To counter the stench, perfume was sprayed all over the Palace of Versailles, including in the fountains. The French court became known as the perfumed court. After the Revolution, perfumers had a new champion, Napoleon Bonaparte, who apparently used 50 bottles of cologne a month. Meanwhile, the southern city of Grasse was slowly but surely becoming a perfume powerhouse, and here too the story begins with a bad smell. Originally, the town had a thriving leather business, but the tanning process made for pungent merchandise, so tanners invented scented leather gloves. Turns out the local climate was perfect for growing jasmine, orange blossom, rose, mimosa, and lavender. Eventually, the perfume industry overtook local tanners, and these days Grasse is still known as the perfume capital of the world.
France has come a long way down the olfactory road, and today it's the world leader in the very lucrative perfume industry.
Well, year after year, France beats its own record. For instance, in 2017, exports in perfume and cosmetics represented 13.5 billion euros, a number that keeps growing.
And whether it's with big names like Guerlain, Chanel, or Dior, or more specific niche brands, French perfumers have a reputation around the world known for their savoir-faire and innovation.
Now, the French take their perfume very seriously. In fact, they have an affectionate name for the people who create perfumes. They're called les nez, the noses, and each year students travel from around the world to France to study smells and become noses.
So just what makes French perfume so great? Flo, you went to find out more.
To find out more about French perfumes, I'm joined by Chiamala Maisondieu. Thank you so much for being with us today. You're a nose at Givaudan, which is a manufacturer of fragrances, and you've made perfumes for big brands like Armani and Lanvin and Lancôme, and you've been a perfumer for about 20 years now. What made you want to become a nose? Is this something that you dreamed about when you were a little girl?
I'm slightly different from some of my colleagues. I didn't know about this job until I actually met a perfumer. And he told me all about what being a perfumer was. And I had done some scientific studies. I'd done chemical engineering, but I was always interested in the arts field. And in fact, when he told me what being a perfumer was, I captured it as being a really subtle mix of, being a scientist, but also using your artistic skills. I thought that's exactly what I wanted to do.
And so what drew you to perfumery here in France?
I've always been attracted by France because of its culture, because of its food, music. But part of the process of becoming a perfumer, for me in any case, was actually to come to Grasse, to the perfumery school. It's actually perfumery which brought me to France.
What would you say is the quintessential French perfume?
I would say Chanel 5, Chanel number 5. Whenever I think of Chanel number 5, I think of Paris. I think of the very elegant ladies in their Chanel suits. And I would also say L'air du temps. For me, it's another type of personality, kind of like the frail French person. And then, of course, there's opium, which is the other side, at the other end, very strong.
Would you say that there's a French way of wearing perfume, of applying it, perhaps?
I'd say the French way would be really spraying it on the wrists and maybe here, behind the ears. And but then there are other ways I know as well. Like, for example, in Asia, in China, they would spray in front of you and they would walk through.
Like a cloud that you walk through?
Yes, and I really like that idea. And I know in Brazil, they would spray it all over the body, like when they come out of the shower, because it has that refreshing feeling.
And why do you think that French people wear perfume in the first place?
I think it's because it's their culture. When you're in France, you hear about the perfumes right from when you're young. So it's like embedded. I think there are people who, you know, they won't go out of a house without putting a perfume on, and so it's part of a ritual for them.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jamila. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Many of you had questions about French hygiene, including our very own Europe editor, Catherine Nicholson. She wanted to know about les bains douches, those public baths and showers that are still in operation today.
Well, the bain douche appeared at the end of the 19th century as part of a policy to boost public cleanliness and to give the poor working class access to running water and not have it just be a bourgeois privilege. And there are many of them around today, including here in the capital, where they're used by 1 million people a year. So it's still very much an important public service because they're used by many people in precarious situations.
Next, given France's high standing in the very competitive perfume industry, many of you had questions about why this stinky stereotype continues, like French person Laurence Gaël, who wrote, "I blame our love of garlic and stinky cheese."
Well, that might explain it in part, but I think it also has to do with the increasingly deodorized society that we live in. And here in France, compared to other countries, especially the United States, there's a certain tolerance for what's natural. For instance, slightly stained teeth, a certain musk, and even pubic hair that's not perfect.
And there's a certain resistance here in France to anything that's too antiseptic or perfect. Anything that's seen as natural or slightly flawed is actually seen as being beautiful.
And there's a big difference between that and stinking. So in my opinion, it's time that we move on from this ancient smelling stereotype.
I agree. That's all the time we have for today's show. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget, if you have your own questions, you can always tweet at Flo Villeminot or reach out on Facebook.
And we'll see you next time for another episode of French Connections Plus.
You have enjoyed your program with Air France Protect, promising you a pleasant trip with total peace of mind.